let's just leave the business people out of it because it's such a hot button. But I'm telling you, we would move so much more quickly as an industry if lawyers could team with business people. And listen, you can spot all the issues around that you want, but business people who have some experience in one sector and bring it to the legal sector is not a bad thing.
I'm Jack Newton, CEO and co-founder of Clio, the world's leading cloud-based legal software provider. In each episode of Daily Matters, we'll explore what this new normal means for law firms, how legal professionals can find success while working remotely, and how lawyers can best serve their clients during this unprecedented situation. Today, we welcome Mark Britton to the show. Mark is well known throughout the industry as the founder and former CEO of Avvo, and he currently is the strategic director of the Madrona Venture Group and the principal at Greater B Corp. Additionally, Mark serves on the board of directors right here at Clio and serves on the board of regents at Gonzaga University. Mark, it's so great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
So Mark, you've got a really unique perspective on what's going on both in the legal industry and beyond right now. Can you tell us what's most on your mind and what some of your key observations might be about what's going on in the world right now?
Yeah, God, sometimes it's hard to think about just legal when so much crazy stuff is going on. I will say it's just this fascinating thing. I feel like every time I open the news, it feels like your parents are fighting. And I guess if I just kind of think about it at a macro level, what I'd love to see is for us to just tone down a bit of the rhetoric and the political rhetoric. But at least here in the United States, it's a little harder when we have an election coming. Toning down that rhetoric and just figuring out how to make the best decisions for the health of our country in the US and up in Canada as well. And I guess there's some overlapping themes that go into some of the industries that I spend time in, but specific to legal. I think, I get excited at least about the opportunity that introducing technology into the legal profession brings. And so I think a lot about that, like, okay, can COVID-19, as ugly as that is, can there be a silver lining in that it introduces an accelerant into the adoption of technology in different ways? But the kind of analogy to what we see at the kind of broader governmental level or even world level is it's fascinating how when you try to change, even in the time of crisis, when you try to change things within legal, there's a faction or two that is just fighting so hard to keep things the way that they are. And I'm happy to dig into that a bit more, but I would love to see a more cohesive, collaborative, systematic approach among the different states, among the bars, to say, okay, let's kind of assume for the next, forever, how's that we will be doing more distributed and online type of activities, whether it's within the courts or with our customers / our clients, et cetera. And what are some ways that we can start adopting some model and or let's just come up with some great ideas to how our courts and our lawyers and administrators, et cetera, might work more online. So seeing some interesting conversations, but I'm also seeing a decent amount of stress and fighting as well that, again, seems to consistently find its way into conversations that we have in legal.
So I do want to pull at that thread in a moment, but maybe to get our listeners on a common footing with your background, Mark, can you walk through your story in an abbreviated way from your Expedia days to founding Avvo, why you founded Avvo? It's a story I've heard many times and I never tire of hearing it. And some of what you achieved over the course of building Avvo. And you did run into some of that resistance that you're describing over the course of building Avvo. Would love to hear where you saw both lawyers and the broader industry resistant to change, how you overcame some of that, and what some of the enduring impact you saw Avvo having on the industry.
Okay, well, there's a lot in there. I'll start by just saying that, being a lawyer myself, uh, my wife's a lawyer. Um, I just, my entire life, I've been surrounded by lawyers. Um, and I just watched how the legal profession it's just such an important part of how we operate our society. Let's just call it in the Americas, any place that has, established solid legal systems, or a set of rules, it's critical that you have courts and lawyers supporting those courts, et cetera, to solve and to help drive forward society. And as lawyers, I mean, we just solve so many problems for our communities, and we help those communities move forward. So I guess I say all of that, and I've always had a tremendous respect and deep love for the legal industry. And I've always wanted to try to push it forward in really positive ways. I think, however, I come at it very differently because I was somewhat unexpectedly, I always loved business and maybe should have gotten my MBA, but I always pursued being a general counsel and ultimately became the first general counsel of Expedia, the travel company. And there I was able to watch both within Microsoft, where Expedia started, and then once we spun out as a separate company, watch some of the greatest business minds at work. Um, and and I think one thing that I really developed there was this religion, towards understanding your customer and being, you know, consumer focused, being customer focused in everything that you do. I mean, that was just the overwhelming mantra at Microsoft and Expedia. It was always, let's start with the customer and then build from that. And the customer was always right, as trite as that sounds. I mean, it was maybe not every piece of what the customer said, but if you sit back and take the totality of what they're saying, they're telling you what they want and need, and you build for them. So I really believed that I could bring that kind of ethos to the legal profession. And I still today feel that is, if there's any improvement, is if there's any place that we can continue to push forward in innovative and great ways, it is, especially on the legal consumer side. So it's a little different when the lawyer's the customer regarding platforms, et cetera. But when we think about who ultimately pays the bills, who makes the legal profession happen, well, it's the customers that pay those lawyers. And having a better culture and better systems for talking to them and listening to them and designing products for them, that's almost everything that I think about. And I'll go very briefly into starting Avvo. I just, it became as easy as saying, okay, whether it's the ethos or the structure of a marketplace, let's take what we did at Expedia and can we overlay that onto the legal profession? So I was marrying my legal background and my Expedia background. So we essentially launched Expedia for Lawyers. The light bulb went off in that, I went off after Expedia. I taught for a while. I was living in Italy and teaching there. And I had this, I was, again, I'm on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, right? I'm nowhere near the United States. I hadn't been practicing for some time because I moved to the business side. I stopped being the general counsel at
Right.
Expedia long before I left. And yet, I go away and I'm teaching finance. I'm not even teaching legal. And yet I'm getting all these calls from friends and family regarding legal issues. And I'm thinking, why are they calling me? They don't call me for travel. And I spend a lot of time and, they don't call
I
me
have this
for
kind of
travel
problem.
issues.
Can you help me
Oh
find a
yeah.
lawyer
So
that?
friends starting companies. I had a friend going through a really tough divorce. It was those types of calls that I'm getting from, these are really bright, educated people. But when it came to navigating the legal profession, they just had no idea what they were doing. And that was the epiphany moment when the light bulb went off to where I said, geez, there are all these tools for travel, which, you screw up your travel trip, you're upset. It wasn't great. You might have lost out on a week or 2 weeks, but you'll get over it. You screw up your legal trip, like your divorce,
Yeah.
and it affects you your entire life. And yet there were no tools. So think of the level of that import. I kind of sat back and said, there are no tools at the intersection of one of the most important or high stakes part of your life, you know, high stakes part of your life and no tools. At that intersection, yeah, there's probably a business idea in there somewhere.
You've got better information about where to go to dinner than you do
Yeah,
on, this, like you said, super high stakes life event.
right. And it's interesting. I feel like with Avvo, we kind of pushed the profession forward, and it was very painful in pushing it forward. But now I feel like it's kind of slowing again, and there, as things move online, and the whether a state is going to allow that real-time video conference, or uh, a platform that allows the consumer to interact with lawyers more easily, whether that platform can get paid or how they get paid, et cetera. There's been a bit of a freezing of kind of, okay, the internet, everybody's gotten used to in the last 10 years, the internet, okay, that we can live with that. But now the internet, as it drives interactivity, is something that I really am watching the legal profession be kind of befuddled again.
So let's explore that. Maybe first, you talked about pushing the profession forward and achieving some level of transformation over your time at Avvo. Can you talk about where you felt like you were able to get to, and maybe in particular where you see things slowing down again now, and maybe to segue into the COVID-19 discussion, how you see COVID-19 potentially catalyzing some of the change that we've seen stall out?
Sure. So to talk about, the historical of Avvo, when we launched, I mean, we were I kind of had that epiphany moment we talked about earlier in the spring of 2005, had the team hired up by 2006, launched in 2007. So this is becoming ancient history, right? And people forget, like, the number one resource for consumers to find a lawyer at that time was the yellow pages,
Right.
right? And so
Yeah.
there was this newfangled thing, the internet. Ooh, geez. And the idea that there would be a review about a lawyer, and a question and answer forum, like, oh my God, let's have everyone's head explode.
Yeah, this is
Um,
pre-iPhone. This is
yeah, oh yeah,
totally
it
different landscape.
predated, exactly. So it really took a while to get the profession's head wrapped around it. Now, I kind of chop the legal profession into thirds, right? So you have the early adopters. There are a lot of really innovative early adopters with technology, and they just go after it. And then there's the wait and seers, and then there I call them the lowest common denominators, the curmudgeons, that no matter what it is, it's bad. And they are going to go to the bar and stamp their feet and say, we have a problem on our hands. And I mean, I often talk about how lawyers are great issue spotters. Um, and that's how lawyers make money. I get it. But when it comes to business, you have to be great opportunity spotters. And I feel like on that spectrum, the one third that are the early adopters, they've built out the muscle memory for both issue spotting and opportunity spotting. And I feel like the lowest common denominator just sit in the issue spotting. But anyway, so this marketplace, so it was so weird for the profession, because we started by not going to lawyers or the bars and saying, hey, what do you think we need? We went to consumers and did a bunch of consumer research to say, why are you lost? And they just said, listen, the big things that came out of it, just very generally, were that they didn't know what lawyers did. They just, and when it came to the process of either hiring the lawyer or after they've hired the lawyer, it was, I mean, we might as well have been trying to teach them Mandarin. It was just so removed from anything that they understood. And especially as you move into lower income, uh, those people have been so beaten up over and over by not having any access to lawyers, any access to the legal industry or knowledge, that they just look at it as this thing that sort of happens to you. It's like getting the flu. The idea that they can be proactive in any way and be empowered in any way, it's just lost upon them. So,
Right.
we sat back and said, we can empower the consumer here. And we'll do it by giving them a number of tools, whether it was the Avvo rating to evaluate a lawyer's background, which Avvo rating was resume scoring in the way that I, as an ex-general counsel and someone who had, been swimming in the legal profession for some time, could evaluate a lawyer's resume very quickly. Can we, that's, everybody loves to talk about AI and ML. Well, you want to talk about some of the earliest AI and ML in legal, that was the Avvo rating. And then we layered on this question and answer forum, which just absolutely exploded, where anyone could come in for free, and this exists today within Avvo, and ask a question, and then lawyers would answer it. And all we were doing there was helping take down the friction between the consumer, so the consumer can come in for free, ask a question, and the lawyer, so they don't have to pay, so there's no friction there, so it's a little bit easier to get them in and just take the first step. And then they're having a conversation with a lawyer and they're like, wow, this person's pretty normal and they don't seem so intimidating and they've told me stuff so that I understand. And then more often than not, they just end up hiring that lawyer. That would then teach the lawyers that, hey, like, you don't need to get paid right on the barrelhead. Take some time, understand your customer, build a relationship, and start using these social networks, these social portals, these social interactions to drive business.
Right.
And so everybody was winning. And that's when the thing just exploded, right? To the point of, over 300,000 lawyers using it as a platform by the time that we sold the business.
That's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, what was so amazing about it is the number of emails and notes and gifts that I would get from consumers or from lawyers, both, and saying, listen, you changed my life, you changed my practice. And we just used to sit back and go, God, we've created a real win-win. Everybody wins. And it was one of it's probably the most, outside of my family, but outside of the personal elements in business, probably the most gratifying thing that I've ever been involved in, just because I feel like we moved the legal profession forward and helped lawyers be more accessible and helped both sides of the equation.
I think one of the things to be super proud of as well, Mark, and the interview you did with Bob Ambrogi, I think he correctly pointed out you've been, one of the most, if not the most influential people in transforming the way the legal industry worked, and that impact with Avvo was enormous and something you should really feel proud about. But when we start thinking about beyond Avvo and where you're seeing things maybe slow down, or as you said, the profession maybe starting to become befuddled about what comes next, and you're starting to see regulators and other bodies start to act in a counterproductive way. Can you elaborate on what you see as the slowdown that is maybe starting to beset the industry despite this momentum that we saw over the last decade?
Yeah, so I think it's a lot of pieces, but I'll try to summarize it as follows. So as I mentioned before, everybody struggled with the internet, but finally got okay with the idea. I mean, what year was Batesville, Arizona? Mid 70s, right? So we're only 35, 55? No, yeah, 25, 45 years from since lawyers have kind of found that it's okay to advertise. The internet was tricky because it allowed every type of lawyer to have a voice, and some of them be more aggressive than others. And it just, some of the most innovative young lawyers and understood how to use that tool were actually able to bring tremendous competition to the more established lawyers or firms. And so that created a lot of stress in the system as to whether this was the appropriate advertising medium. And so it took I would say that It was probably about a 5-year process to where the bars started saying, no, this is it's imperfect, but it is something that we we can live with, and we look at it as a tool that is good for both consumers and lawyers. And so let's call that, around 2010-ish.
Yeah.
So we've had a pretty good run for the last decade of, if it relates to lawyers advertising on the internet, the bars are pretty good with that. But it is just a digital extension of what they were doing with billboards for the most part. So the bars are okay with a website, and they're okay with you having an intake form and some Q&A. But all of it largely just feels like that billboard, right?
Even there's a huge chunk of lawyer websites that just say, call my
Right.
800 number in the same way the billboard would have, right? They're basically digital
Right.
billboards.
That's right. And so if you think about where the rest of the industry, or the rest of the world, but a lot of other, whether it's white collar or any type of industry where they're interacting with the world, um, many people, there are platforms and there are technology that are being developed for uh, people to interact more aggressively, more meaningfully with the service that is coming their way. So, what's a good example? Uber. Um, so, you know, um, I, I hesitate with the Uber example, because the visceral reaction, if you're talking to many lawyers, is they're like, I do so much more than just drive a car, than car service. But I'm just trying to keep it simple, right? We get it. I get that lawyers do amazing things, but if you think about how kind of boring and overdone, like, did anybody think that you could change the paradigm in hailing a cab? No. It's like, but I mean, it was just so, it was so boring and set, and would there be money in it, what have you. But with a simple iPhone app that allowed the drivers of those cars to better understand who they were picking up, and who the people who needed a ride better understand the car that they were getting into and the driver. And with other smaller tools, like, when are they showing up, and um, uh, how easy is it for me to pay them? I mean, all Travis and the Uber folks did was say, how do we bring together these very needy consumers who really hate the um, hate the cab system as it is, and marry them with a bunch of a much broader set of capacity, which is beyond the cabs themselves. It's people who just have a car, and bring them together in a much more efficient and actually conversational way. When you really sit back and think of that app, it's you're not always talking to the driver. You can text them and pick up the phone, but it's the way that there's information flowing back and forth, so each person understands what's happening,
Yeah.
which is the essence of communication. So that is one example. I could give you a number of others. And I'll add one extension to that I think a lot of people miss when you're talking about an Uber or an Amazon Prime, et cetera. By having these platforms, they actually have a number of requirements for you to succeed on to even be part of the platform, but especially to succeed on the platform. So you have to have a certain type of car. It has to be clean. You have to have this kind of driving record. You can't have a criminal record, et cetera. Amazon Prime, you have to use their boxes. You have to ship within so many days. You have to take returns in a certain way. And what a number of these platforms have done that I think sometimes the consumers miss is they've created a set of rules that are super sensitive, super centric to their customer base, because they've done all this research into what their customers want and need, and they require that of the supply side. And it ends up molding an output for the consumer that is tailored to them. And whether they really internalize that or consciously think about that, subconsciously they internalize it, and they love there's that wow moment because somebody has listened to them and delivered something to them that is so tailored to them by requiring that the supplier, the supply side, behave in a certain way. So, and we could go on with example after example of where this is happening in different industries. Now, in legal, again, I think we kind of stub our toe right at the outset because we're not listening to the consumer, and we believe that we're smarter than the consumer. And I especially think this happens in a lot of courts, like a lot of judges who set, the tone for a lot of regulations. I have worked extensively for many Supreme Courts and many groups of judges to talk about the future of the law. And consistently, I run into judges who there's tremendous hubris in there to where they believe that only they really can design how the courts and how the legal process and the legal regulation works. And for me, that's where I collide with them. And I think that's where sometimes people think I'm kind of a rabble rouser, because I don't want to hear what you think as a judge. I don't want to hear what you think as, like, I just want you to tell me what the customer thinks. Now, we can do some of our judgmental overlay on that, or if there's kind of a disagreement between the customers as to where we go first or how we do it. But for you, without any research or even talking to your target audience to tell me what you think is just irrelevant. It's so antithetical to how businesses
probably
work.
Wrong as well. And I think something you did at Avvo that we've continued the tradition, so to speak, at Clio in some of our consumer research through the Legal Trends Report. We see over and over again that lawyers' expectations of what consumer preferences are, and I'm sure to an even greater degree, judges' expectations around what consumer preferences are wildly off. There's a massive chasm between how consumers want to consume legal services and the way that the legal industry broadly believes they want to consume those services.
That's exactly right. And so, as just a small point, if there was any takeaway here of that kind of long preamble I just gave you, for any lawyer watching this that runs their own business, if you're not getting input from your customers as to how you're doing, you're failing, right? Because you just can't design a level of services without that conversation. But now, getting specifically to your question, I feel in all these different industries, with technology, the moving a lot of functionality. So I think it starts with the smartphones, and then moving a lot of functionality into the cloud with SaaS-based systems so that you can be processing a lot in the cloud. I think a lot of it works with the ability to distribute. So whether it's through voice or video or document sharing or collaboration, there are all these different pieces of software that are making the end user experience or the peer-to-peer experience so much more fruitful. And it is this just, I can't even put a great word around it, but when it comes to the legal profession, and we start talking about the ability for lawyers to interact in real time, say prior to the conflict check, that's one that always comes up, or how the money is not funneled immediately into a custodial account, or whatever the issue that you may be spotting. As it relates to this more technical, distributed, collaborative use of tools, the bars are that we're just not moving forward on those, right? I'll give you a great example. And I want to be careful here because I don't want to use anyone's name where it's not my job to be using their name. But okay, so there are companies out there. So I continue to advise a lot of companies, and some of them are from outside of legal, and some of them are in legal, and some of them are outside of legal and thinking of getting into legal. And so I end up having a lot of those conversations, whether it's kind of the marketplace or the tools, and then sometimes with the overlay of legal or getting into legal. And consistently, in these conversations, you have very smart business people. More often than not, they're not lawyers, but they have tremendous SaaS expertise. They have tremendous technology or collaboration expertise. I mean, they're coming out of companies like Google, right? And they're saying, God, this tool that we were using at Google, to the extent that we were able to overlay this into the client, into the litigation process or whatever it may be, we would really like to do that. But still, that person cannot bring that idea into legal and share in the goodness that they bring. Now, you can charge a fee, like you can charge a SaaS fee, like Clio does. But what if that legal person is looking to team with the business person to essentially run a better type of law firm or a better type of dispute resolution? And in those instances, the minute that it starts to touch on possibly, having business people involved in law firms, or non-judges, non-lawyers involved in certain types of dispute resolution, that lowest common denominator, the curmudgeon crowd, will step in and tell the executive director of their respective bar that there is a massive problem and that they need to stop it. And so it causes, either just tremendous fatigue in people like me, or fear, to where people say, geez, I don't want to get in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But it freezes the market. And so, without going on and on about this, let's just leave the business people out of it because it's such a hot button. But I'm telling you, we would move so much more quickly as an industry if lawyers could team with business people. And listen, you can spot all the issues around that you want, but business people who have some experience in one sector and bring it to the legal sector is not a bad thing.
And as you pointed out, you gave a great talk at the 2019 Clio Cloud Conference, Mark, on lawyers are from Mars, business people are from Venus. It was a fantastic talk, really, really well received. And it's available on YouTube, by the way, for anyone that wants to search for that title. They'll enjoy the talk you gave. It was so informative. But you make,
10 million views.
10 million views and climbing. It is a fantastic talk, though, and you make a very compelling point that, hey, lawyers are business people, and you spend a lot of the talk motivating what some might view as a controversial point. I don't think you or I do, but law firms are businesses and need to be run as such. So the idea of teaming with a business person to help improve the delivery of legal services and improve access to legal services doesn't seem like it should be as controversial an idea as it appears to be, at least for, as you pointed out, some of those curmudgeons.
Yeah, I think when you come at it, I think that conversation gets more relevant when you come at it through the lens of a number of lawyers would rather just be technicians, and that's okay, right? Like, you have a number of lawyers who went to law school because they love the law. Thank goodness.
Right. Yeah.
But they don't want to do the business stuff. And so what happens is they almost believe that the business planet is a separate planet. And that was the kind of the through line on that speech is, you're already running a small to medium to large business. But I think for the majority of people who are in that room, they're running small businesses, right? And I was just trying to help them understand that so many of the what makes a business person is not rocket science. It's not magic. It's not a separate planet. You're already on the planet. So that was kind of what drove that speech. And then, however, if we go back to this third of the most entrepreneurial lawyers, I think what 90% of them would tell you is like, oh man, if I could just take what I do and get an investor and some of the experience of that investor in medical or in restaurant delivery, I don't know whatever you're doing, it's probably been done before. And if you can find someone who's an expert in that area and have them be your partner and have them have a financial interest so that they put everything into it, that's what the most entrepreneurial lawyers would love to at least have the option to do. And it's just, it's partly in the States because we have 50 different regulators. You have all the provincial regulators up in Canada. It's very broken up. And so there's some common rules. But I can say that down in the States, the problem happens is that you have 50 regulators and 50 sets of curmudgeons that are going to intimidate those regulators with any new piece of technology that does not fit absolutely squarely within the rules. And I'll just wrap it on this point to try to pull it all together, is that if you were to bring in your average business person into legal, let's not say average, let's say somebody with a tremendous amount of experience at a top technology company, they would say that 90% of time in the legal industry is wasted. Whether you look at it, the lawyer's manufacturing process and manufacturing their brief or their contract or their case, their communications that they have with their customers, their interaction with judges, they're having to physically go to court and stand in court. The idea that you cannot have every hearing over, I used to say over FaceTime. I used to show in speeches, I would say, this is the court of the future. And it was a phone with four faces talking. And that would just send people over the edge as far as saying, you just can't do that. I remember I had a judge telling me in a closed door meeting I had with an undisclosed state group of judges. Supreme Court was there, Superior Court, most senior judges were there. And I had a judge just go after me. And he said, you don't understand what it means to be a judge. You've never been a judge. And I cannot administer justice in any situation without looking that person in the eye. And I just thought, I get it. I get the body language. I get that you're reading the person, but you can do that over the phone. You're still looking at them, right? It's almost like he viewed it as being behind a black curtain.
Right.
And, I just told him that I respectfully disagreed. So, you touched on this a little bit earlier. You said, so does COVID push us forward in any way? Well, that may be an area where we're having a number of hearings online. Most courts have pushed the pause button. But it would be really neat if we were to see a lot of this stuff, especially for certain orders, like restraining orders or early motion. The more administrative stuff, being able to do that from a desk and discussing it with the judge would be so much more efficient. I mean, just so little needs to happen in that courtroom. And I would argue that nothing needs to happen in that courtroom, by the way. Yeah, but anyway, these are the types of things that when you bring them up, and if you were to bring a business person into the mix, the judges and the curmudgeons, not saying that they're perfectly correlated, but let's just call it the curmudgeons, would say, you don't know what you're talking about.
So your vision of the FaceTime with four people attending a hearing looks prescient now. I got off the phone with a judge from Florida just before this podcast, and she described the fact that they have now 28 judges doing hearings over Zoom calls and have had over 4,000 hearings now over Zoom, and it's really starting to happen. So I do think we we are seeing the crucible that is COVID-19, maybe, finally catalyzing some of this change. And maybe a final parting thought from you, Mark. This has been a super interesting discussion. We could go on for hours, and you and I have when we have the leisure of that time, and maybe a glass of wine. But focusing in on a closing question, how do you think about the changes that were maybe underway? You spent a lot of time thinking about what the future of legal services looks like at Avvo, and have certainly seen you offer a super valuable perspective on that as a board member and investor at Clio. What do you see maybe that you thought maybe was off in the distant future, the 10 plus year time horizon, potentially getting pulled ahead thanks to the change that COVID-19 seems to be driving? As you said, the silver lining in all of this is maybe that we're seeing transformation accelerate. What do you see that accelerating in the legal industry?
Okay, here's kind of how I chunk the legal industry in my mind. There's the acquisition of the customer, so the marketing, but that conversation that I was talking about, there's that
Yeah.
piece. Then there is the processing and administrating with that customer, the interaction, and Clio covers a lot of that. Then there is the lawyering piece that is in parallel with the work that you're doing for the customer. And I would probably call that the manufacturing line. I mentioned that earlier, possibly. But so, there's the customer tells you what they want and need, and then as the lawyer, you go off and manufacture it. And those two things don't touch a lot, and they shouldn't necessarily touch. You go off and write your brief or what have you. It's not necessarily for the customer to get involved in after they've told you all the facts.
Right.
And then there is the judicial part, right? So I look at four parts. There's the acquisition part, there's the operational administrative part, there is the lawyer art / manufacturing part, and then that kind of overlaps into the judicial piece.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that is moving in almost every other industry, and I think is coming to legal at a decent pace, is the number of tools that serve as platforms. So in lead gen, it's just not Yellow Pages advertising or Google advertising. It is actually identifying a potential customer and getting them to a platform and creating interactivity there and creating conversation and reconversation, et cetera. Very similarly, the platform, as you move it into the operational piece, you're seeing more and more tools. And by the way, a lot of this is driven because investors are finally starting to believe and starting to understand, how much money's in legal, and how ripe it is for disruption. But we're seeing a lot of investment. So on the operational and on the manufacturing line, one of the struggles in that historically is that there is so much data. There is so much, imagine it's like this, it's this field of data often. We often talk about data lakes. It's this lake of data that you can't get your arms around. So we're starting to see platforms. Clio would be a phenomenal example, but you're even seeing it in the litigation process where they're using AI and ML to, they're using technology, a platform and technology to first help people get their arms around all of that data, all those pieces that impact their practice operationally or in the art of law. And then AI and ML is helping them think through how these pieces pertain to any given instance.
Right.
And so, and I think we've had the least amount of innovation, or we're least ripe in the innovation on that judicial side. But I'm a big believer that right in that middle, if operationally we can make law firms more efficient, and we can, whether it's client records or conflicts or legal research or whatever it is on that, those operational pieces, and make them much more graspable and snapshotable and understandable for the lawyer, that will ultimately spill into the courts, because the courts are more efficient. They see it happening well within the law firms. They understand it better. And you start seeing judges, for example. I mean, a judge like, think about the process. And I won't go on and on about this, but a judge right now in understanding and processing case law hands a massive stack of documents or a massive zip file to a clerk who reads it all. Okay. And then they have a conversation that goes back and forth on whether it all makes sense. So much of that process in other industries is being automated.
Right.
And while the judge can be the ultimate arbiter and overlay, machines will have to have their place. There's so much case law out there, and there's so much bad law that is driven because you have judges or clerks that didn't get their arms around it all. But machines can help us process, understand, push that entire process forward. And unfortunately, when it comes to the courts, I think we're 15, 20 years out on that. But if we can do better in the middle, or maybe even on the client acquisition, but it doesn't quite touch. It's, I think it really sits in the operational part for law firms, both on the client side and the art side and the manufacturing side. The more that we can grasp all of the different vectors that impact those operations and the art of being a lawyer, all boats will rise, and it'll be the firms, it'll be the lawyers, it'll be the law clerks, it'll be the courts themselves.
And tying this all back with some of the earlier parallels you were drawing to the Ubers of the world and the Amazons and the Airbnbs that have focused on the client experience, focused on the consumer, I think the key point here as well is they've in turn unlocked enormous latent demand that didn't exist prior to those.
Exactly.
So the lawyers looking for the opportunity in all of this, if you're able to innovate, and we need I agree wholeheartedly with you, we need the courts and the judicial system to evolve in kind to match this opportunity to better service the needs of the market. And I think what you helped accomplish at Avvo, and is still a lot of work to be done, is this data that we see from the World Justice Project that 77% of consumers did not have their legal issue resolved by a lawyer. On the supply side, you see most lawyers telling us they need more work, they need more clients, they need more cases. There's still there's a bridge to be built connecting those two worlds. And I know you and I both believe technology is got to be a big part of that. A concluding thought, Mark, the conversation has been amazing and the time has flown by. A parting thought, I would love for you to think about a call to action to, our listeners are everyone from lawyers to bar leaders, the executive directors, the presidents, and some judges that are listening, to help enable the change that you think we need to see over the next decade. If we think about chapter 2 of the book we're writing about legal transformation, what would your call to action be?
I can really come up with so many of them, but I think they all. So let me frame it like this, and I'll try not to be too verbose. We are taught as lawyers to be perfectionists. Perfection is the absolute enemy of good. Perfection is the absolute enemy of progress. And man, if that's not one thing I learned early in technology, is technologists, business people, they experiment a lot. And when it's not perfect, then they quickly pivot and they modify it, but it allows them to get things out the door, and it allows them to have the conversation with their customers. And so I feel that whether it's from the regulatory top-down point of view, or the small business, single solo lawyer who's just hanging a shingle and trying to make it, if I could tell them all just one thing, again, there are a lot of things I would tell them, it would be progress, not perfection. That is something. I'll close with this kind of funny story. I used to tell my legal team, when I was the general counsel at Expedia, I would always tell them progress, not perfection. Like, that contract does not need to be 100% perfect. Know the 8 things that we die over, let the rest go. Like, just move the business forward. And they even gave me a plaque. It's in here somewhere in my being renovated office, but it says progress, not perfection. I found out after the fact that that is actually a mantra for Alcoholics Anonymous. And somebody saw it in my office and was like, "Hey, did you go to AA?" So maybe I picked it up from somewhere. I don't know, but whether you use it for Alcoholics Anonymous or whether you use it for your practice or your court, it's so important that we as an industry have to make progress, and we cannot be stymied by trying to be perfect.
That is a fantastic note to end on, Mark, and it ties in really nicely with something I've talked about a few times over the course of this show as well, which is that COVID-19 has given us a really unique opportunity to experiment as a profession as well.
Yeah,
our clients,
you're right. And be imperfect.
Be imperfect. Your clients are ready to roll with whatever. They're open-minded.
That's a great point. I might use that, by the way. I should have come up with that. We should have pre-briefed, and then I could have sounded smarter.
Well, we had a terrific conversation. I think this is why you and I enjoy working together so much. We do have a really productive jam session when we find the time. So thanks again for joining us, Mark. This was a fantastic conversation.
Always my pleasure, Jack.
Thanks for joining us on Daily Matters today, a podcast from Clio. Rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Daily Matters is produced by Andrew Booth, Sam Rosenthal, and Derek Bolin, and hosted by yours truly, Jack Newton. Thanks also to Clio, the world's leading cloud-based legal technology provider, for supporting this podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Clio, please visit clio.com.